to Sophal's presentation. Sophal, the screen is yours.
Everybody, and we're back at this part 2 of the last time we met, and the title of my talk changed slightly from its earlier version, Cambodia's Conceptualization of Regional and International Order. And I want to start really at the end of the paper where, and most of you have heard this before because it was in the summary that Kanti and Evan sent to us, but essentially the argument, which I think really framed the situation in Cambodia, is that Cambodia seemed to regard the Western powers as insisting on the liberal international order norms and institutions, but using these norms and institutions instrumentally to interfere in Cambodia and delegitimize the regime. At the same time, Cambodia insists that it is truly democratic and multilateralist. So it seems to affirm certain norms such as democracy and multilateralism, but argues that the US and other Western powers only use those norms against rivals and weaker powers when it suits their interests to do so. So that's a bit of what Sophal just talked about in terms of what China sees the LIO as, and you can kind of hear the echoes here in that interpretation. For the referees who were not present in part 1, I do have my earlier talk in the YouTube video. If you want to share or want to watch that, I had it at I did send it to my referee. So that in advance, so that she could see. Now, I know we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of the Asian values debate, which we sort of started talking about in workshop 1, and it's referenced in the notes. But I do think that it's worth just mentioning here briefly that there is obviously something to be said there. I mean, the argument that that somehow Asian values differ from Western democracy, or that democracy isn't something innately natural to Asian values, is really one that is not being argued in Cambodia. That's not something that the authorities there are saying. We don't believe in democracy, or we don't believe in something we call democracy, which of course is their version of democracy, which is more like performative democracy, elections without democracy. So, just to remind everybody, it was this exchange between Lee Kuan Yew and Kim Dae-jung in foreign affairs that really, I think, cemented the idea of Asian values. And of course, the rejoinder from Kim Dae-jung, which was that there's a myth to Asia's anti-democratic values. Now, of course, it isn't as if Hun Sen talks of these Asian or Cambodian values. He talks of democracy, but he seems to claim explicitly that democracy is what is happening in Cambodia. And of course, what he means by democracy is not what we always understand to be democracy. It's more of this view that democracy in Cambodia is being done, but everybody else from the outside seems to look at that and say, this is not what's happening. The democracy isn't, in fact, what we're seeing in Cambodia. And those of you in session 1 would have remembered this quote that I used then, which he actually said, real democracy in Cambodia has not been set back or fallen. Instead, it has been protected and strengthened in accordance with the principle of the rule of law for the great benefit of the people and nation. Only fake democracy has been abolished. So taking essentially the mantle of democracy and saying, this is what's happening in Cambodia. Of course, you don't have an opposition party that is threatening the ruling party anymore because it's been dissolved by Hun Sen's courts. And so is it really democracy? I mean, how can one say there's democracy when the main opposition party isn't there? And the same kind of argument about sovereign equality are being used, where Hun Sen's argument is always this kind of, let us solve our problems ourselves, stay out of our business, stay out of certainly Cambodia's internal affairs, but also stay out of the region, United States and other Western powers. So it's a refrain. It keeps happening, and so one has to think about what exactly does Cambodia want, or what exactly does Hun Sen want? Because I clarify in my paper that there's of course what the people want, but they're not being listened to, and there's what the authorities want, and they call it national security, they call it national interest, they call it whatever the kingdom of Cambodia wants, whatever the Khmer people want, but it's whatever it is they, the ruling party, want. So what is really going on in Cambodia? One has to call a spade, I suppose, in that I would argue, and the paper makes this argument, that it's really about regime survival. And the argument for the liberal international order, or whatever context one wants to talk about, is essentially, how does the regime in Cambodia survive, whether it uses the LIO's mantle or the word democracy to its own benefit, but in fact doesn't practice it, seems to be what's happening. Whether in China, certainly, regime survival is the name of the game now. It's the predominant trend in China's power politics, or in Trump or North Korea. It's certainly about some kind of questioning whether it's an electoral outcome that you don't like in the case of Trump, or not allowing any kind of democracy at all in the case of North Korea. And Cambodia, of course, has been cozying up to China to create this perception that it is, extremely close, and it's probably going to get the support of China with whatever it is it needs, certainly, should it come to need that. So you've seen a few of these slides before. I won't repeat them. His argument, Hun Sen, has been that the international order becomes a sphere of opportunity for Cambodia rather than a sphere of scrutiny for Cambodia. That sphere of scrutiny is the sphere of questioning Cambodia for whatever it does, saying that it's not practicing human rights, that it's not practicing democracy, that it's undertaking unfreedom in that way. And so, this spreads to other areas where then it means that for Cambodia, the ASEAN way, for example, we know is one of consensus. So Cambodia would use the ASEAN way to essentially block the organization from moving forward. When Hun Sen says ASEAN without Hun Sen is not ASEAN. So he's essentially using Cambodia's membership in ASEAN to make sure that whatever it is he wants becomes the name of the game. And so we've seen that with Myanmar. We've seen that with the South China Sea. I'll end with a few points that I didn't have time to delve much into, but what changes would Cambodia make to the international order? It's not clear that Cambodia has a vision like China does, perhaps, of those concentric or that Venn diagram that was used earlier in Sophal's presentation. That essentially there's an area where it's the liberal international order, the UN Charter principles, and China's view. I'm not sure they thought this far, but certainly they've argued that there's this color revolution that's being forced on them on the authorities, this regime change mentality. So they want that to stop exporting hunger and revolution, language that, of course, China's Xi has used. Stop interfering in Cambodia's and the region's domestic affairs, that stay out of our business. And what does Cambodia want to keep from the international order? I think it's notions of legitimacy, typically framed as performance legitimacy. They'll trot out the numbers, GDP, low inflation, et cetera, and say, look, we've done so well. But in the end, they still want not just performance legitimacy. They'd like to show that they won the election, even if the election was completely crooked and they counted the votes. As Stalin said, those who count, those who vote decide nothing. Those who count the votes decide everything. So it's kind of masquerading as it's kind of performative democracy, the trappings of democracy, but not really the risk of loss. And of course, being Cambodia, it's whatever riches can be pursued while dispensing with anything that would risk regime survival. So enrichment of the elites there to their own benefit at the expense of everybody else, without, of course, losing power. They don't want to lose power. So my conclusion would be that there's considerable irony, of course, in a country using the language of the liberal international order, feigning outrage while claiming it is a bastion of real democracy. To that end, the Hun Sen regime's conception of international order is one now aligned with China's vision, rooted in this color revolution and regime change argument that's being imposed from the West, and perhaps a Beijing consensus that promotes an illiberal Chinese-centered international order that still reaps economic benefits from the open liberal market space developed by Western democracy, but practices as little democracy or real democracy as possible. All right, thank you.